Hey folks, Andy Patton here, joined today by college hoops analyst and Gonzaga alumni Connor Hope of HeatCheck College Basketball. Connor and I are going to discuss Gonzaga's two new additions, Efton Reid and Dusty Stromer, as well as some of GU's current transfer targets, the return or the potential return of Julian Strawther and Drew Timme, and the latest bracket buster proposal. All right here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Don't go away.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. I am thrilled to be joined again today by Connor Hope. Connor was a frequent guest of the Score Zags Score podcast before I transitioned over to Locked On Zags. It's been a long time coming, but I finally got him back on the show. Excited to get a chance to talk to him about all of the exciting stuff going on with the Zags. Connor, thank you for taking time out of your day to come on the show.
It's always a pleasure to hop on and talk Zags basketball with you, Andy. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I think we've tried 2 or 3 times and always ended up having to cancel at the last minute. So it's nice that we finally got a chance. Like I said, there's a lot to actually talk about with this team right now. It was a really slow start to the offseason. I won't lie. I was getting a little nervous. I was like, am I going to run out of things to talk about? But fortunately, the Zags finally struck. They added Efton Reid via the transfer portal out of LSU. The Zags were connected to a bunch of front court guys. We were talking Johnny Broome from Morehead State. We were talking Daz Amack from Utah Valley. There was a handful of other names. Kenneth Lofton was a name I just saw. He's still out there. But what do we think about Efton Reid? He was not necessarily the highest profile name on the portal, but definitely a guy who I think you could see where the fit might be with Gonzaga. I'm curious your thoughts about his fit at GU.
Yeah, I mean, he was the big that I was most excited about the transfer portal, I think. Separating Drew Timme from the situation.
Sure.
Right? If Drew Timme doesn't come back, of course you want a guy who's proven in the way that Johnny Broome or Fardaz Amack or any of those, or even KJ Williams, if he decides to return to school and transfer, although he's probably going SEC at this point. Efton Reid, despite the fact that he didn't shoot terribly well from deep for LSU, has the ability to provide vertical spacing, stretch the floor with his ability to screen in a way that Drew Timme doesn't, and in a way that can allow him to be on the court if Drew Timme were to return. If Drew Timme doesn't come back, he's still a former top 30 recruit, 5-star guy who, when he was on the floor for LSU, proved that he could be a good, skilled big on the offensive end, has the body to put himself in a position to be a bit like a Shemek Karnowski, not necessarily going to block a lot of shots in the way that Gonzaga fans might have become accustomed to with Chet Holmgren and Brandon Clark, but alter shots, get in a good space defensively. LSU's defense was good, but it was a switch everything defense, which put him in a little bit of an uncomfortable position when he had to guard some of those wings on the perimeter. Gonzaga's not going to force him into that. They'll probably play him in a little bit closer to a Chet Holmgren role, not necessarily requiring him to make a lot of those mistakes that the perimeter guards last year made on the defensive end go away. I think the guard defense, the perimeter defense for Gonzaga this year is going to be fantastic. And so he just has to be in the right position. It's one of those, it could be a home run. He could be there 2 years, live up to that 5-star billing. But even if he doesn't, he's going to be a solid big that can play on the floor with pretty much anybody in that Gonzaga front court.
I love that you mentioned the spacing situation, because I think that was a lot of people's initial concern for people who didn't watch a lot of LSU basketball, who were just looking at the box score, who saw a guy who who did most of his scoring. He didn't do a lot of scoring last year, although that was more of a product of LSU as a whole not being a particularly good offensive team, but he didn't score a ton and he didn't do a lot of scoring away from the rim. And I think a lot of people's kind of initial reaction was, okay, great, this top 25 prospect, we got somebody that's fantastic, but is he going to be able to play alongside Drew Timme? And obviously we do not know the future for Drew Timme. That's, a part of this whole thing that is a mystery that makes it a little bit more challenging to figure out what Reid's role is going to be. But you're saying, hey, he may not have shot it great from deep, but if he's asked to play a role potentially farther away from the rim offensively because of what, the dynamicness that is Drew Timme down low, you're saying, hey, I don't think that's going to be an issue. He's more than capable of playing away from the rim.
Yeah, I think he's that guy who could be the perfect kind of pick and roll man. Big body, can set those picks as a big target around the rim, and can finish. And if Drew Timme were to leave, he fits that prototypical skilled big man for Gonzaga. He's not going to, be a powerhouse, dunking over people, playing above the rim.
Right.
But if you look at the past bigs for Gonzaga, I mean, Drew Timme, Filip Petrusev, Przemek Karnowski, they really don't need an above the rim center to be successful. Chet Holmgren spoiled Gonzaga in that sense, where he could shoot the three and play above the rim if needed. They don't need that to be successful. They've been successful for the past decade without having a long string of those types of bigs. So, I think give him time. Gonzaga is one of the 2 or 3 best, you could argue the best development programs for bigs.
Yeah.
And when you come in with the skill set that Efton Reid came into college with, I trust Mark Few and company to really develop him into the big that is needed in this Gonzaga rotation.
So we kind of mentioned taking Drew Timme out of the equation. We're going to bring Drew Timme back into the conversation at this point. I'm curious your thoughts on if this move means anything regarding Drew Timme's future. To me, at least, I think some of the other bigs, you mentioned Broom, you mentioned Amac, if they had come to Gonzaga, I felt it might have signaled less likelihood that Drew Timme was returning. This move is, like you said, it could kind of go either way. Reid could step into a pretty big role if Timme were to leave. Reid could also be a more complementary piece if Timme were to return. Do you, even regardless of Reid, do you have a sense what you think Drew Timme is going to do? I'm feeling pretty 50-50 personally, but I'm curious your thoughts on kind of where he's at.
Yeah, I think it's probably 50-50. I've heard good things about Drew Timme going through the draft process, so it might be dropping, unfortunately. But, look, if he comes back, Efton Reid fits into that rotation. Whether he's starting at the 5 or coming right off the bench, he fits into that rotation. I agree with you. If Broom or Amac or any of the other bigs had come, they were proven entities that were looking to step into a huge role at a power conference team or a national championship contending team and play that big role. Reid can be that 3rd, 4th, 5th option scorer who plays within the system, develops himself into a draft prospect, because that's really what he needs right now. And I think that's what he's willing to do. You saw it a little bit with this time around. His recruiting out of the transfer portal was a little bit more understated than his recruitment out of high school. So I think he was looking for the right fit. I don't know if that indicates anything particularly about Drew Timme, but I think it does play into the staff's desire to have someone that can be that starting center if Drew Timme were to leave, or could play with him as that, he's going to play the 4 on offense and the 5 on defense if Drew Timme were to return.
Yeah, we're talking about a guy who started all 34 games last year for LSU, but only played about 20 minutes per game. I feel like whether he's starting or coming off the bench for Gonzaga, a role somewhat similar to that makes a lot of sense for his development and for what Gonzaga needs, or at least is unsure what they need at this point because of Drew Timme's uncertainty going forward. Connor, I want to move on. I want to talk about Dusty Stromer before we get into the second segment. Gonzaga's other addition from last week. They kind of, like we'd said, quiet off season. All of a sudden, bam, within an hour of each other, the Zags land Efton Reid from LSU. They land Dusty Stromer, high school kid, class of 2023, top 40 in his class. Jeff Goodman compared him to Tyler Hero. I think that's a pretty pretty intense, maybe a bit ambitious of a comparison, considering Hero just scored 21 points per game in the NBA this past season. But I am curious with your research on Stromer, kind of taking a look at him and his potential fit at Gonzaga.
I mean, he strikes me as that stereotypical Gonzaga wing, long body guard who can shoot the ball relatively well, is more athletic than people necessarily will think when he's on the floor, and can fit into that 2 or 3 or even that small ball 4 spot for Gonzaga. You mentioned the quietness of the silence that came out in the first couple of months, or the first month and a half after the season ended. And that's been Mark Few's MO for a decent portion of the last decade. I mean, you look at transfers and even freshman recruits committing, they've all generally committed either within that first month, the freshman recruits after the tournament ends, or, Admon Gilder came in, I believe, May. Ryan Woolridge came in June. Gino Crandall, Aaron Cook, like they all committed later on in the off season. And it really speaks to Mark Few, Brian Michelson, Roger Powell looking for very targeted recruits that fit the system, can play within the system, and give them what they need, instead of some of these other teams that are kind of casting a wide net and bringing in, a lot of big time recruits. Gonzaga is very surgical almost in how they recruit players. And that's why you see we haven't really had, as Zag fans, a transfer come in the last 5 or so years and not play well, not play a rotational role. Freshmen, Dusty Stromer might not have that immediate impact, but he has the skill set to become the next Corey Kispert or I'm blanking, Kevin Pangos, although he's not a point guard, but like that type of player who can make an impact as a freshman, but really catches on, as a sophomore, junior, and so on.
Yeah, I think you absolutely nailed it with Gonzaga's. I mean, they're not batting 1,000 on transfers overall, but for the last half decade, they're pretty close to batting 1,000. Like, they have done a tremendous job of identifying players, and it seems like they know what role they're going to fill the day that they sign them, and those kids come in and fill that role perfectly. You look at Rasir Bolton, obviously you mentioned Woolridge and Gilder and Crandall and Aaron Cook, all those guys, I mean, have really filled roles super admirably. And that's kind of what I want to talk about in the second segment. It's a perfect segue. We're going to talk about if the Zags may not be done. Efton Reid's a great addition. Obviously, Stromer's not going to be around next season, but the Zags may not be done building for next year's roster. There's a couple transfers that they have been connected to. We're going to talk about them in the second segment. All right, Connor, Iowa State's Tyrese Hunter, Texas Tech's Kevin McCullar, those are the two big names right now in the transfer portal. Both have been reportedly connected to both Gonzaga and Kansas as their most likely destinations. McCullar is also considering the NBA. I'm curious, out of these two guys, they're not quite the same position. McCullar is a bit more of a wing. Hunter is a traditional point guard. If you have a preference between these two players in terms of Mark Few's system, just kind of which of these two guys you think might fit better at Gonzaga?
So when I look at these two players, I tend to assume that they're going to come in for 1 year. There's a possibility that either of them can stay for 2. But I'm going to assume that it's going to be 1 year. Tyrese Hunter, obviously, big time recruit, can be an NBA draft prospect like that if he wants to. Kevin McCullar has been around the block in the NBA draft process right now, so there's no guarantee he does come back, but a little bit more experience. Both of them can play the point guard position. Kevin McCullar, though, what he gives you is a little bit more unique in that he gives you more experience. He can handle the ball, but he can also play off ball, and he can play alongside Nolan Hickman in kind of that Mark Few, very stereotypical 2-point guard lineup that he loves to run. Even last year, although Rasir Bolton wasn't nearly as much of a true point guard as you had with Nigel Williams-Goss and Josh Perkins, or Andrew Nemhard and Jalen Suggs, he still handled the ball quite a bit. But it's the defense, I think, that's the biggest differentiator. Kevin McCullar is one of the most was one of the best defensive perimeter players in the country last year. He can handle the ball. He can score if needed to, but he doesn't need to be that high scoring ball dominant player. So if he were to return as someone who's looking at what Gonzaga's roster needs, I'd rather have him, because I have a sense that no matter who comes over, because Hickman has been in this system for one season already, he's going to be the primary point guard. What he needs is someone experienced enough, someone who can give him relief when he's on the bench, someone who can help build him into a much better prospect. For as fantastic as he is, he still has a ways to go. And so I trust McCullar to be able and willing to do that, rather than Tyrese Hunter, who's in the same position as Nolan Hickman, going for that same lottery kind of projection in the NBA draft. That might be a little bit more of a competition between the two, where I think McCullar could come in, be a complementary piece, and really do everything that would make him fit into a seamless Gonzaga system, rather than having any sort of headbutting or mismatch in what they have on the floor versus what they need, kind of thing that Hunter and Hickman would provide.
Could you imagine the Zags have the possibility to run out lineups that would include Hunter Salas, Kevin McCullar, Anton Watson, and Efton Reid? And I don't know how opposing teams are going to score points on that lineup at all. Like, that is such a ridiculously talented defensive lineup. Any point, Hickman's obviously a good defensive player as well. So if you were to toss him at the point guard, that lineup, probably not Gonzaga's best offensive lineup, certainly. But I mean, geez, they would play some really, really tremendous defense. I want to stick on McCullar a little bit more. Basically, the main question is, how realistic do you think it is that he's even coming back to college at all? Because I know he's an older prospect, and the offense, like you said, it's not so stand out that he's like a guaranteed draft pick, but he shows up on a lot of mock drafts, and certainly guys his size with his ability to handle the basketball who play defense the way he does, they tend to have NBA careers. So I'm curious your thought on how likely it is that he's even going to be playing college basketball next season.
It's probably a shade under 50-50. I do think that the reason why Kansas and Gonzaga are the top two for him is because if there's one thing that he would need to do to raise his draft stock, because he's past the point where this steep drop off in draft stock occurs, right? That happens after your freshman or sophomore season. The difference in draft stock between a junior, a senior, or a super senior isn't as big as between a freshman and a sophomore and a junior. But the one thing he needs to raise his draft stock is really showing that he can play in an NBA style offense, can play that we're going to run the ball up and down the court the entire game. And that's something that Gonzaga provides that very few other programs in the country do. And so I think, if he comes back, what I've been hearing is the lean is Gonzaga. It's just whether he comes back. I think it's probably a shade under 50-50. Just because, like you, I've seen him on a couple of mock drafts, but he might get the feedback that they want to see him on a more offensively inclined system, which would then kind of force his hand to come back and prove that he can play, a bit of a faster game of basketball.
Absolutely. And I think you see a lot of guys who are gravitating towards Gonzaga's style of offense. We didn't mention it with Stromer, but that was something that he mentioned very specifically when talking about his recruiting process, as he wanted to go somewhere where he could run and get out in transition and do all that. And it certainly makes sense for players who are eyeing the NBA to get an opportunity to play in a system that looks as much like that as you're going to find in the college game. Similar question to what we talked about with Drew Timme, and Efton Reid. Do you think McCullar's recruitment says anything about where the staff is at with Julian Strawther? I know McCullar is more of a ball handler than Strawther, but I think he would probably kind of play more of a wing role for Gonzaga as a secondary ball handler. Do you think that, I guess I'm kind of gauging your temperature on Julian Strawther in general, but also if McCullar kind of moves the needle one way or another with him?
No, I think McCullar's coming to Gonzaga would be closer related to where Rasir Bolton stands with coming back for his fifth year than anything else, because Strawther will play the 3 or the 4. He'll rotate between those two positions. Obviously, McCullar can play the 1 through a small ball 4, but I think that McCullar can play that 2 alongside Strawther or start at the 3 if Drew Timme were to leave and Strawther were to play that 4 alongside Efton Reid. But I think if Rasir Bolton comes back, then you have this issue of, McCullar's going to have to compete for minutes with Bolton. He's going to have to compete for minutes with Hunter Salas and Dom Harris. And so that really creates a little bit more congestion, especially when he wants to handle the ball. Hickman's going to handle the ball and Bolton's going to handle the ball.
Right.
And so I think it says more about Rasir Bolton than it does about Julian Strawther, because I think Strawther is in such a unique position where he's really the only player in that system that plays that kind of role that Corey Kispert played, the kind of 3-and-D, play the wing, play the small ball 4 type of role that those other guards don't play. And there's a lot of them that are going to be competing for minutes next year.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of what I wanted to get into with Tyrese Hunter as well, because, McCullar does have a little bit more flexibility. Certainly Julian Strawther has a handful or quite a bit of flexibility as well. Tyrese Hunter does not, from a positional standpoint. He is a point guard. He averaged 5 assists per game last year for Iowa State, which is incredible, but that is his role. He's a distributor, not a great outside shooter. He's a phenomenal player, and I don't want to put him down, but it is a little bit harder to see his exact fit. Certainly a 2-point guard lineup of Hunter and Hickman would be very, very good offensively. They would be a little bit undersized, which you can get away with in the WCC, but you maybe can't get away with that beyond that. I'm curious your thoughts on Hunter's overall fit at Gonzaga, or perhaps the likelihood, because he strikes me as somebody who would do really well at Kansas as well. So I'm not sure what the temperature is on him in terms of those 2 schools.
Yeah, I think the temperature on Hunter is that he's a bit more of a long shot for Gonzaga. And that's not a bad thing, because again, I think McCullar fits the offense better. Really, both of these recruitments are going to take a little bit longer. McCullar's in the NBA draft process, as is Rasir Bolton, as is Julian Strawther. And so you can play the long game with McCullar a little bit more, because, if you get 2 of those 3 to come out of the draft process and be in Spokane next year, that's a win for Mark Few. But, Hunter might commit a little bit earlier and might not be willing to wait out that draft process of the other guys. So, I think he's going to end up staying in the Midwest, probably going to Kansas. But you have to throw your name in the game. You have to at least make that phone call for a guy like Hunter, especially when you're looking for, 2. If you have 2 high-powered point guards playing alongside each other, it's really tough to beat that. And I think Mark Few knows that. Yeah,
and that's kind of what I was talking about on an episode recently, when people were asking if this player, if Gonzaga recruiting this player means this or means this. And in some cases, you can read the tea leaves a little bit, but in some cases, Gonzaga is just trying to get the best 12 basketball players that they can get, put them in Spokane, and Mark Few will figure out what to do with them after that. And sometimes I think that there's too much is this why we're doing this? And it's maybe there's something going on behind the scenes, but ultimately when really, really good players are in the transfer portal, they're going to give them a call. they're going to try to get that dude to come to Spokane, because they just want really, really good basketball players. So it makes sense that Tyrese Hunter may not be a perfect fit, but he's really talented. And if he really wanted to come to Gonzaga, they would figure out a way to get him onto this roster without a doubt. Connor, we're going to come back in the third segment. We're going to move a little bit away from the transfer portal. We're going to talk about the bracket buster proposal that came out about a week ago or so. We're going to talk about what it would mean for the Zags. Before we do that, though, I want to tell you all about today's sponsor, BetOnline. The 2022 NCAA tournament is in the books, with a win secured by Bill Self and the Jayhawks of Kansas. While the Zags unfortunately fell short of the game's pinnacle week, that does not mean fans cannot remain in on the action. BetOnline.net is your #1 source for all of your betting needs and sports information. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, you name it. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your latest sports developments, including podcasts and reviews for all of the leagues this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags, still here chatting with Connor Hope of Heat Check College Basketball. I almost said busting brackets because that's what's in my notes, and also your former employer. Connor, I do want to talk about the report from WAC Commissioner. So Brian Thornton, the WAC Commissioner, proposed this bracket buster style in-season tournament. We talked about it on an episode last week. For those of you who missed out, there's a great article by Matt Norlander of CBS Sports that kind of breaks the whole thing down. Basically, multiple leagues would pause their conference slate in, I think it was the second week of February, somewhere in there. And there would kind of be this round robin style 2-game tournament where each team would be pitted against other teams that have similar rankings, like using, I think, KenPom and various other sources like that, so that each of these teams would pick up a high quality opponent. At least for Gonzaga, it would be a high quality opponent. 22 conferences showed interest in this. We know the Power 6 conferences were not among them. I think it's safe to assume that the WCC was among them, although I don't know for sure. I'm curious, Connor, your thoughts just in general about this proposal. It's kind of one of the things that a lot of people have been clamoring for, something like this for a very long time. Certainly, it seems like it would make some sense for Gonzaga. I'm curious your thoughts more generally about this and what it would just mean for the sport.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic idea. And when it comes to Gonzaga, it would do two things. It would replace BYU on their schedule, which is something that they need to do, because as bad as BYU was, or as disappointing, I guess they weren't bad in the grand scheme of things, but as disappointing as BYU was this year, they are still consistently two of Gonzaga's probably 13 to 15 top 100 games every year. And not having those on your schedule anymore after they, leave for the Big 12 is going to give Gonzaga's resume a hit. And they can certainly fill that void in the off season, or try to, or not off season, I guess the non-conference season, or at least try to. But what we've seen is that, they've added an incredible amount of high caliber opponents in their non-conference, but it's still about 50-50. So if you were to look at those two now open games on their schedule, it'd probably be one power conference team and one, mid-major team somewhere in the Pacific Northwest or Southwest, that it would be a bye game that they would pay to play them in McCarthy. I think what this does is it gives them that BYU caliber opponent, and probably an upgrade, because they would be playing if the American joins, they would be playing the top of the American, or if the Mountain West joins, they'd be playing the San Diego States and the Colorado States. Or if the Missouri Valley joins, they'd be playing the top of the Missouri Valley. So there are quite a few of those types of programs that, if Gonzaga were to add two of them to their schedule, they almost improve their schedule over what they would have had with BYU on a year-to-year basis, which I think is huge. On the flip side, it could hurt some teams, because now you're taking a Pepperdine, for example, who is at the bottom of the league this year. They lose those BYU games, and now they're playing two probably bottom 50, bottom 100 teams in the country. Games that you can't really afford to lose, especially late in the season. So, there's a lot of logistics that need to be had, but I think especially for Gonzaga, this is something that they should push the WCC to look into as we wait for, any of those rumored talks with other conferences for a potential scheduling agreement with Gonzaga to progress.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's no guarantee that the WCC will still have Gonzaga in a couple of years. Certainly there's conversation about them trying to change that up a little bit, but assuming it does happen, you got to think that this is a slam dunk for the WCC at large. Gonzaga it's not going to hurt them from a tournament perspective. And the WCC, the biggest thing for them is making sure Gonzaga is still making the tournament and still going far in the tournament. It's not going to hurt that. It's going to get them this opportunity to play, Houston or Memphis or San Diego State in the middle of February, which is great for them. St. Mary's is going to get a similar boost. They're going to play comparable teams to all of those teams as well. Again, without BYU, after that, it kind of gets a little murky. I'll be super fascinated to see games like, San Francisco playing the third or fourth best team in the American. Like, I think that's going to be interesting. It probably doesn't move the needle all that much in the tournament perspective, at least probably not going forward. Obviously, last year was a bit of an anomaly with USF being as good as they were. But I think my big curiosity, it's probably good for Gonzaga. There's really limited there's very limited reason it wouldn't be good for Gonzaga, even if they lose those games, which wouldn't be great, but it's not going to hurt them too much. But I'm curious your thoughts on what it does for mid-major programs just in general, because we're expecting it's going to be most, if not all, mid-major conferences that are participating in this. So these really good teams are going to play each other, which helps them get better, but it also, every game has a loser. So some of these teams are going to lose some of these big games. And, you look at a team like San Francisco last year that snuck into the tournament. If this had happened and they had played, they lost to Loyola Chicago in the non-conference, but what if they lost to them again in February? What if they played Murray State, for example, and lost to them in February? Like, that might cause them to not make the NCAA tournament. So I'm curious if you think obviously if every team's a mid-major and every team wins or loses, it's hard to know exactly how helpful it is, but I'm curious if you think it's going to get more teams in the big dance from the mid-major conferences, or if it's going to kind of not make a big difference.
I don't know if it's going to make a big difference in terms of bids. It's going to really just play a role on those bubble teams.
Yeah.
And my assumption is that, the teams that are playing each other at the top are going to be the teams that are clearly in the tournament, regardless of whether they win or lose that game. The teams that are out of the tournament can't really boost themselves in. It's those bubble teams. And I think what it does is it gives a greater ability to solidify one of those bubble teams in the tournament than it does really kind of messing with how many teams are going to be in. It just might, instead of a team being in the first four, it might give them the opportunity to get that bye into the first round.
Right.
And then outside of that, I think there's also the argument that it's good for TV and TV revenue, right? Gonzaga, they sure they get televised on ESPN for the game against St. Mary's and BYU, but could you imagine how much, and at what time in the evening a Gonzaga versus San Diego State game would get?
Yeah.
Like, that wouldn't be an 8:30 game that nobody watches. That would be like a 5:00 game on an ESPN2 or something that people would watch, because it's two of the top mid-majors that are perceived as such. And so it's not perceived as, oh, Gonzaga is just going to beat St. Mary's. It's,
right.
They're playing the top team in the Mountain West or the top team in the American. And so it kind of gives them, I think, a greater source of revenue and a greater exposure to the casual fan, especially late in the season when everything is about, those major conference championship races.
So the last point I want to ask you about for Gonzaga, obviously the prevailing conversation about the Zags for literally 20 years at this point, it's only gotten stronger in recent years, is the conference schedule that they play, that the teams in the WCC, how it prepares them for March. Obviously, this team has marched to the Sweet 16 for the better part of a decade. So a lot of those people who say it doesn't help them in March are just wrong. But how much of a benefit do you think it is if Gonzaga, imagine if this last year's Gonzaga team got to play Houston on Valentine's Day last year. I have a hard time not thinking that would help them when it came around to March Madness. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it seems to me that even if they won that game, if they lost that game regardless, I feel like that kind of game helps them be a little bit more prepared in March. Do you feel the same?
It's hard to tell. I definitely agree that playing those types of games will help for early round close games, right? Winning if you're not a 1, 2, 3, or even 4 seed, you're going to be in a game that's probably pretty close.
Yep.
And playing those tougher games later, especially in that first round or first weekend, definitely helps with you being able to push through. By the time you get to the Elite Eight, the Final Four, the national championship game, your schedule before the tournament doesn't really matter. People point out all they want to Gonzaga's schedule when they were undefeated heading into that game against Baylor in the national championship game. But they had played Creighton, they had played Oklahoma, they had played USC, they had played UCLA. They had played 4 games in a row against top 25, top 30 teams in the country. At that point, they were there.
Yeah.
Baylor was just a really good team that punched them in the mouth for 10 minutes. It was 30 minutes of competitive basketball the rest of the way, but they just couldn't overcome the hill that Baylor had put them in. But I don't think Gonzaga's game against Pacific in February or January affected their ability to play Baylor or their readiness to play Baylor when they had played 4 other high quality teams leading into that game. So, yeah, I think if you're expecting Gonzaga to maybe take a step back this year, and they probably will, or you're expecting a Gonzaga team in the not so distant future to be a 5, 6, 7, 8 seed,
right?
I think that's where it really starts to make that difference. We've played one of these top mid majors that are also in that kind of caliber or that range. But when you're the number 1 team in the country, and then you play 4 teams in a row or 3 teams in a row getting to an Elite 8, to make it, to sharpen your skills and sharpen your readiness for those games. At that point, I have a hard time believing that your schedule heading into March had anything to do with you losing a game against, at that point, a team that also made it to the Elite 8, Final Four, or national championship game.
Absolutely, Connor. That was a perfect note to end on. That was fantastic. Before I let you go, where can people who are interested in reading your work or following you on Twitter, where can they go in order to get that?
So you can follow me on Twitter at HoopsHopesCBB. I am a co-host for the Hope and Ralph podcast. We've gone monthly now that we're in the off season, but during the season even leading up to the season, we go weekly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, pretty much every podcast platform. And then I'm also, I'm right for HeatCheckCBB. I'm working on a piece right now, funnily enough, that talks about the last 4 teams in the national championship game and how each of them approached the transfer portal, like I said, very surgically and targeted, as opposed to some other teams that we've seen this offseason and last offseason that kind of cast a wide net, get a bunch of these top recruits, hype them up, but because they weren't surgical about it, it doesn't tend to work out in the end. So look for that piece. That piece will probably come out towards the end of the week.
Very excited about that. We'll definitely retweet it because that sounds like an interesting topic. Connor, thank you again for coming on the show. That is going to do it for us today. Thanks again for listening. One more season in review episode coming later this week. We also have another guest episode and, of course, a look at the baseball team ahead of their big weekend against Santa Clara this week, right here on the Locked On Zags podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube as well. All right. Thank you all for listening, and go Zags.